If you're struggling to hit your shots in XDefiant, or you just want that extra bit of clinical gameplay going into the release of the game, then this video is going to save you a lot of headaches. There are a couple of settings that you can change, but also a couple of mechanics worth understanding in terms of how XDefiant functions that is going to make you a more accurate player when you take on any given gunfight. XDefiant has a very interesting time to kill and time to death experience. It feels like sometimes if you don't land a headshot, the TTK can be very long, but it can also feel like that you die very quickly under certain scenarios. And a lot of that is down to accuracy, and being as accurate as humanly possible in this game is a huge bonus because the headshot multipliers in XDefiant are massive and absolutely determine the majority of gunfights. This video will be split up into sections for those of you who are specifically looking for controller settings, which is something that's very important, and also wider gameplay settings, which affects absolutely everyone. But before we dive into those specific settings, it's worth understanding the core mechanics of XDefiant and why so many of you so early on are struggling with being accurate. Right out the bat, many of you are going to notice and realize that the movement system can feel quite strange, especially when shooting, because you're effectively moving at any given time, even whilst aiming down sight, whether you're using the left stick or the WASD key, at a much more rapid rate than other games. And this means that your strafe speed and how you're strafing in the game actually has a larger impact on the accuracy of your weapons, especially those of them that are running on low bullet velocity, and more especially those of them with lower rates of fire. What many of you are going to be realizing is that you're missing a lot of your shots because you're strafing in one direction and aiming in the other, and you're not hitting a perfect alignment or equilibrium between these two mechanics. Strafing in this game has a huge effect on every single bullet you fire, and I would highly recommend toning it down where possible, especially over the longer ranges, and strafing less. But at the closer ranges, you need to be making sure that your strafe and your aim down sight are transitioning together. And there are a couple of settings that we can change to make that feel a bit more seamless and work a bit more better. But it's worth noting that if you're strafing all the way to the left, you need to be compensating for that strafe in your aim down sight. The second mechanic, which I've already touched on, is headshots. A headshot in a single gunfight in XDefiant is pretty much a guaranteed win with the vast majority of weapons. The multipliers for it are absolutely huge, and if it feels like it's taking lots of bullets to kill opponents, but it feels like you're dying extremely quickly, then this is why you're having that experience. Lower body shots aren't going to cut it, chest shots are decent, but headshots are king. A lot of people are coming from Call of Duty into XDefiant, and Call of Duty notoriously has high damage output on lower parts of the body, whereas XDefiant doesn't. So you are very much punished for not being accurate in this game, as it should be in a competitive environment or a 6v6 or 4v4 shooter. And finally, the third thing is aim assist. There is substantially less of it for those of you playing on controller, and some of you are just going to struggle with that. Call of Duty has the largest aim assist of pretty much any first-person shooter you will ever play. It is incredibly powerful and does a lot of hand-holding for players. And if you're coming from Call of Duty, you're going to notice that you're substantially less accurate. And that is the harsh truth, and I'm saying this as a controller player on both XDefiant and Call of Duty Warzone. Now, the first settings that everybody wants to touch are the gameplay settings, and there are a couple here that are going to uniquely affect how you aim in this game and how things are going to work. The first is your field of view and field of view behavior, and the second is the ADS sensitivity transition. Now, generally speaking, I would highly recommend playing on a higher field of view unless you are super far away from your display. If you're playing on something like a TV and you're sitting a fair distance back, a higher FOV probably isn't going to work for you. But for the vast majority of people, a higher FOV is generally better because it allows you to see more of your surroundings, and also it actually reduces the magnification on your weapons, thus making visual recoil less apparent. I play on a 27-inch monitor and always recommend floating around 110 to 115, and under the ADS field of view, you want that set to consistent. And what this means is that your FOV is always going to remain the same whether you're aiming down sight or if you're just hip firing your weapon, and this means you're going to have a much more universal experience between both ADSing and not ADSing, and you're going to have less visual recoil as well. For ADS sensitivity transition, I always set this to instant, and the reason for this is because the second you ADS, you want to feel under control. And for those of you who change their sensitivities on keyboard and mouse, this is something you'll want to pay attention to. But even those of you on controller, we are going to touch on the settings here, and ADS sensitivity transition is key, having it to instant is great, and there are a couple of settings I'm going to show you on controller that are going to work good. There isn't much to touch on for keyboard and mouse players because ultimately XDefiant is using raw input, and once you have your field of view settings dialed in, it really is about finding the right sensitivity and DPI scale. I personally play on about an 800 DPI and tend to play on a lower sensitivity, but other people try different things with higher DPIs and lower sensitivities in game. Generally speaking, I would say that you want to be able to have a full 360 degree of motion without having to move too far across your mouse pad, but at the same time, you don't want to be too overly sensitive when aiming down sight at opponents. Let's dive into the controller settings, and if you're somebody who has felt like the game just generally feels unresponsive and weird, you're not alone. And these controller settings are going to fix that for you. It's going to make the game feel more snappy and more responsive, and make you feel more in control of your movements. Now, to start with, I always recommend the brawler layout because that will allow you to crouch and slide by clicking into your right analog stick, and generally speaking, that is preferred. I personally play flipped. I use my L1 and R1, but that is personal preference and something you don't have to change. On aim assist, you're leaving this to standard in terms of strength and flow, but aim response curve, you're changing to the reverse S curve. And this is similar to the dynamic response curve, which is in Call of Duty Warzone. And what this means is that when your analog stick is all the way on the edge of the actual analog, you're going to move left and right faster, but when it's in the middle of the analog stick, you're going to have less sensitivity, which is going to allow you to be more accurate whilst aiming down sight at opponents, but also allow you to snap left and right far quicker. The majority of pros throughout all of Call of Duty Warzone use the dynamic response curve, which is a reverse S curve, and the same will apply here in XDefiant. For horizontal and vertical sensitivity, you want these to be identical, and changing them is actually going to give you less consistent behavior in terms of how your controller operates and is going to throw you off. Now, if you're struggling snapping left and right on opponents, you could arguably tone down the horizontal sensitivity, but I would not recommend it. Now, I play 10-10 sensitivity on Call of Duty Warzone, and I play 70-70 in XDefiant. But I would recommend scaling downward for the vast majority of players, something along the lines of 50-50, 60-60, or even trying 40-40 depending on your sensitivity preferences. Now, between the S curve and also the sensitivity, you should feel that the game has instantly become more responsive, but it's more about how much sensitivity works for you. As a 10-10 player, 70-70 feels perfect with the reverse S curve, but for those of you who play on lower senses in Call of Duty, if you're somewhere around 8-8 or 7-7, you may want to scale this down, but make sure both of those values are the same. Next, we have the ADS sensitivity multiplier, and we're putting this down to 0.85 for both low zoom and high zoom optics to create uniformity between those experiences. We aren't making this super low, we're leaving it at 0.85, and the reason for that is because we don't want our sensitivity from hipfire to ADS transition to be too radically different, but we do want to bump in terms of accuracy by slowing down some of that sensitivity generally. Next up is your dead zones, and your dead zones are really critical here. I would recommend having a higher left stick dead zone and a lower right stick dead zone. Having a higher left stick dead zone means you're going to do less of that micro strafing that can throw off of your aim, and that's something that I think is really important. So I've gone for a 10 dead zone on left stick, and I've gone for a 6 dead zone on your right stick. Now, ideally you want these as low as possible, generally for most first-person shooters, but I think that XDefiant is a unique case. Now, the problem XDefiant generally has is that the response curves are a little bit sharper, the acceleration is a little bit faster, even if you have acceleration speed multipliers turned down to 0. So dead zones can be quite critical in how your controller feels. I recommend 10-6 for pretty much everybody, regardless of what sensitivity that you're using, and that is what I would stay with for now. Hopefully this will make everything feel far more responsive in terms of how XDefiant operates. Now, generally speaking, for those of you on controller, the game has a sort of feel to it that's very different. On your left stick, you are capable of jumping left, right, backwards, and even sliding left and right to some extent and strafing back on yourself. And all of those added movements in terms of how XDefiant operates, it just makes the game feel a lot more different to more conventional shooters that slow you right down when you're aimed down sight, or slow you right down when you do too much movement. In XDefiant, you have a bit more free control here. There's also no weapon spread or bloom in terms of aiming down sight and jumping, so you can be equally as accurate when jumping or sliding, and that's something that's radically different from other games as well. Combining these settings with understanding that strafing is hugely impactful and that there also is an aiming down sight bloom in terms of moving will make you understand that you can be far more accurate in XDefiant and get those critical headshots that make the difference. If you found this video useful, folks, please drop a like, consider subscribing, and I'll see you again in the next one.